Such is the story of Madoc ab Owain Gwynedd, a Welsh prince who is said to have sailed to America in the year 1170. That's 300 years before Columbus set foot in the New World. The story of Madoc is pretty well known in Wales, and it's been examined in quite a few books.
400 years later, during the time of Queen Elizabeth I, the tale of Madoc became politically convenient. It was used to add legitimacy to her government's claim to American territory, which Spain guarded as her own. The story became prominent again in the late 1700s. This was a turbulent time of revolutions and republicanism, when some Welsh people were emigrating to North America to seek greater personal freedoms and more prosperous lives.
Over the centuries, some people have accepted the story of Madoc as fact, while others have dismissed it as a complete myth. However, the tale inspired a young Welshman to look for the evidence, if it existed. And that turned out to be an epic adventure of danger, hardship, and discovery.
Quite remarkably, his quest led to him exploring the North American interior to represent the King of Spain. And what he saw and recorded was important. It made a significant contribution to an historic expedition just a few years later. But first, that story of Prince Madoc. He is said to have been one of the many sons of Owain Gwynedd, a successful king of Gwynedd who really existed. He had many children, although no records exist to prove that Madoc was one of them.
After Owain's death, his kingdom fragmented. Violence erupted, and Madoc, so the story goes, wanted to get away from it all. He got on a ship and sailed into the western horizon, eventually to land in North America.
In 1584, the Welsh clergyman David Powell put the story of Madoc in print. In his History of Cambria book, he wrote that Madoc set sail with about 100 others and crossed the ocean to find a land of abundance, where they established a colony. A later writer claimed that Madoc then returned to Wales, recruited many more immigrants, and sailed back across the ocean in 11 ships. Since then, claims have been made of Madoc's supposed landing places in the Americas, mainly in what are now the southern states of the USA. Madoc's colonists were said to have travelled north. They encountered local tribes with whom they allegedly integrated. The stories of Welsh Indians, as these indigenous people are then called, took root. Reports emerged of fair-skinned native people who used Welsh words. It is even said that they fished with small vessels like Welsh coracles.
People wondered if it could be true. No doubt some hoped that it was. But where was the proof? And that is where the young man from North Wales enters this story.
John Thomas Evans was born at Waenfawr, near Caernarfon in North Wales in 1770. Orphaned as a child, he became a farm labourer. He spoke Welsh and was said to be very interested, even obsessed, with the story of Prince Madoc. At 21, John Evans moved to London and fell in with other Welshmen who were excited about reports by missionaries and hunters of people in the Great Plains of North America who had Welsh blood. John Evans decided that he was going to find these Welsh Indians. He linked up with the Welsh poet Iolo Morgannwg, and an expedition was planned to find the people of Madoc, the Madogwys, or in English the Madogians. Iolo backed out, but John borrowed money and sailed to Baltimore, where he found work. He later travelled to Philadelphia, home to a growing number of Welsh immigrants. From there, he got ready for his expedition westwards.
It would be dangerous going into uncharted territory at a time when there was sporadic warfare between European powers and the local American tribes. And there was also the danger of wild animals, bears, wildcats, snakes, and also the risk of disease, of course. Friends tried to dissuade John from taking this potentially suicidal journey, but he was determined, and as he wrote back to his friend Iolo in London, Madagion or death.
Early in 1793, when he was 23, and despite much advice, he set off with $1.75 in his pocket and walked across the Allegheny Mountains, a part of the Appalachians, to reach Fort Pitt, where the city of Pittsburgh now stands. He then somehow took a riverboat 700 miles down the Ohio River until he reached the Mississippi River. From there, he travelled north to where that mighty river is joined by the Missouri River. It was a long journey of extreme hardship for a man who was almost certainly very badly equipped. Much later, he wrote that he had endured some of the severest hardships, I suppose, was ever experienced. He added, for example, that he had travelled several miles in water from the hip to the armpit amongst a numerous crowd of the biggest water reptiles I ever saw. John had entered Spanish territory, Louisiana, or New Spain as it was then commonly called, at a time when the European powers were competing to carve up land in the west, beyond the newly independent United States in the east. Suspected of being a spy, he was briefly imprisoned by the Spanish, but after some months others spoke up for him, and the story of his unlikely quest was believed. Then the Spanish found a use for him. Quite surprisingly, he was made second in command of an expedition up the Missouri River by the specially created Missouri Company to head northwest, trade with native tribes, assert territorial claims for Spain, and find a route to the Pacific Ocean. It was also intended to keep Spain in control of trade by reaching agreements with tribes so as to block out the influence of the Canadian British. The expedition was a mixture of nationalities. Evans was second in command to Scotsman James Mackay. Mackay had become a Spanish citizen. Both had taken an oath of loyalty to the Spanish king. Most of the crew were French, people who had settled on land previously governed by France. At this stage it seems that John spoke neither French nor Spanish. Communication must have been a challenge. They set out in 4 riverboats. John had evidently learned skills as a surveyor while working in Baltimore, and later was taught more by Mackay, who gave him clear instructions of everything he was to record during the journey. And those instructions were incredibly detailed. Mackay had written, "In your journal you will place all that will be remarkable in the country that you will traverse, the route, distance, latitude and longitude, also the winds and weather. And make a note of all the minerals, vegetables, timber, rocks, flintstone animals, game, reptiles, rivers, mountains, fish, shellfish." And there was even more than this. No information was to be left out of John Evans's report.
This was quite a turnaround. John Evans had gone from being a prisoner of the Spanish to an agent of the Spanish king. This wouldn't have gone down very well in London, but it was tremendous good luck for him because he was now going to be paid for going to more or less where he wanted to go.
The expedition up the Missouri River encountered several tribes of native peoples with whom they traded. Then John set off further north with a small group of men to make further discoveries. A hostile encounter with the Lakota warriors, more commonly known as Sioux, made them flee back to the main party. But eventually talks were held with the tribes and he was off again. But he was not in good health. It seems that since the start of the journey he had contracted malaria, which laid him low several times and was to trouble him greatly. He wrote that on occasions he could walk no more than 100 yards without needing to stop and rest. But despite his serious illness, he was not to be deterred from his mission. Later reflecting, "I was determined to risk my life, feeble as I was, and start to the Illinois."
An idea had grown that it was specifically the Mandan people, who had, courtesy of Madoc and his party, that Welsh ancestry and a smattering of the Welsh language. A French explorer had reported that the Mandan people had a settled lifestyle quite different to that of the nomadic people of the Great Plains.
The Mandans lived in round huts and they farmed animals, so it was said. There were also reports of well-built stone structures, and so it was assumed, from what we may now see as a racist belief, that only Europeans could have been responsible for them. That turned out to be untrue. John travelled north into what is now South Dakota, with its bare, dramatic scenery, and then, finally, after this massive effort, he found the people he was seeking, the Mandans. He was warmly received by them. This was the moment of truth for John Evans's great quest.
And what did he discover? That they didn't look very European at all. There was not that much sign of fair skin, and as for the Welsh language, there was no sign of that at all.
He stayed with the hospitable Mandans during a harsh winter that seems to have further damaged his health. He had presented himself to them as the emissary of the Great Father, the Spaniard who inhabits the other side of the Great Lake. Fur traders from the United States and Canada arrived, but John had lowered the British flag over what was described as an English fort or trading post, and he had hoisted the Spanish one. He was evidently happy to switch his allegiance from the British crown. He couldn't have had much love for it. But was the Spanish one any better? Or was it just a matter of looking after his own interests? We can only guess at his motives.
It seems that John was absolutely determined to stop any commerce between local people and Spain's rivals, but he had problems. The first was that the Mandans wanted to trade. They wanted the goods that the newcomers were bringing them. The second was that he couldn't compete. His own supply of trading goods was drying up. His company, the Missouri Company, was running out of money and failing. The bad feeling with the Canadians grew, and there was a plot to murder him, prevented by the Mandan chief Black Cat and others, so John wrote later. He was in a dangerous situation with a very small group of men. The cards were stacked against him. It was time to leave.
He headed back down the Missouri River, 1,800 miles of which he had explored and charted. He had gone so far upriver that it took him all of 68 days to travel downstream to St. Louis, even with the furious current of the Missouri. John Evans had used his surveying skills to record information about the Missouri River and its tributaries. He made 7 detailed maps. These maps were later said, although this is doubted by some, to have been acquired by President Thomas Jefferson, who sent them to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, 2 military men he had asked to find a direct route to the Pacific Ocean.
The Spanish held John in very high esteem and gave him a job as a surveyor, but he was in very delicate health, and having found no trace of Welshness amongst the Mandans, he may have had rock-bottom morale. He might have thought that he had expended so much effort and ruined his health chasing what was looking like a myth.
The evidence indicates that John Evans's sketches of the Missouri and its tributaries were copied and greatly assisted the Lewis and Clark expedition, which just a few years later explored the lands to the west and crossed the Rocky Mountains to reach the Pacific. Later analysis showed that John's maps were indeed very accurate. As for John, probably with great sadness he rode home to his Welsh friends. Thus, having explored and charted the Missouri for 1,800 miles, I am able to inform you that there is no such people as the Welsh Indians. Land he was promised for him to settle down never materialised. Then he was robbed of his few possessions. He went south to New Orleans as a guest of the Spanish governor, and, allegedly, perhaps in great despondency, took to the bottle and slid into alcoholism. The governor wrote that the strength of liquor has deranged his head. But there are those who think that this sounds out of character for a religious and virtuous soul such as John Evans. They speculate that his condition could, just possibly, have been a feverish recurrence of his malaria. Whatever it was, he died in May 1799 at just 29 years old. His bones lie in an unmarked grave somewhere in New Orleans. This video is just a brief telling of the life of John Evans. There is more detail available. One very entertaining read is American Interior by Griff Rhys, probably best known as vocalist with the Super Furry Animals Band. He retraces John's steps with facts, humour, and informal gigs along the way. I've drawn heavily on Griff's research for this video. John Evans's work, along with that of James Mackay, made a great contribution to the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. But despite his massive effort and the ruination of his health, he had found no sign of the fabled Welsh Indians.
He may have been a disappointed soul in very poor health, but John Evans was a significant explorer of the American interior. The young man from North Wales had set out on an epic journey with courage and determination. The farmhand had become an explorer and an excellent map maker.
Sadly, most of John's journals are lost. They would have been very interesting. Nevertheless, enough information survives to ensure that John Thomas Evans earned his place in American and Welsh history.
And as for Prince Madoc in America, the evidence is as elusive as ever. But the story of the Welsh Prince's great adventure will surely live on.